what if I told you that all the feelings that you feel are not always yours? I'm talking guilt, shame, fear, frustration, and all the negative emotions that you may feel in your body. Some of them may belong to you, but some of them may not. And no other study puts a flashlight on this than one that I recently found, where there was a study done on rats. And what they did was they kept shocking rats before it exited its cage. Kept doing it and doing it and doing it, shocking, shocking, shocking. And after a while, the rats just would no longer even leave the cage because they don't want to be shocked or attempt to leave the cage. Then the rats have children, little baby rats, going all over the place. And do you know that those child rats never even tried to leave the cage? And you ask yourself, how is that? That wasn't their own personal experience being shocked. That wasn't their own pain, their own fears, their own frustrations coming to the surface because of something that had actually happened to their own body. But it still affected them as though it were. Now, what we're calling this today is ancestral trauma. Now, ancestral trauma is pain that your ancestors felt that you didn't necessarily feel. So you ask yourself sometimes, why do you feel these emotions? Why do you feel sad? Or why are you afraid of enclosed spaces and you've never been locked in a closet? Why don't you particularly like certain people, certain groups, certain things, and you never had any reason to be exposed to them negatively? It could actually be due to trauma that runs through your lineage that you're unaware of. So you ask, how does trauma actually affect you? Well, trauma is a two-pronged issue here, right? So we have trauma that affects us biologically, which we just talked about, but we'll go into it a little bit deeper. And then we have trauma that affects us behaviorally. So now what we need to do is figure out what kind of trauma could we have been affected by, right? We know we weren't rats being shocked by a current and then stopped, right? But we do know that it affects us very similarly. So let's just put out the obvious. We have slavery here and genocide. Let's say those are two very traumatic events along the lineage. So let's say our ancestors go through slavery, some form of ethnic cleansing or genocide, and they are affected biologically, right? Now, when I talked about how the children, like yourself, you feel pain or you bear some sort of burden that you don't understand because you hadn't been affected by it personally. But what we're attempting to explain is epigenetics. Now, epigenetics occurs within your DNA. Okay, so we all have DNA from our mother, DNA from our father. Now, down our line from our mother's lineage or our father's lineage and our father's lineage, all of them have experienced some level of trauma. And what epigenetics talks about is how DNA will actually rearrange itself because of a traumatic experience. So let's say we had ancestors who were a part of a heinous movement of slavery or genocide. Imagine what that did to them, those lashings, those beatings, the aggressions, the violence, the fear that they held. Imagine how that actually mutated their DNA, changed the way that their genes actually express themselves. So that's called epigenetics. And because their genes changed because of a traumatic event, then they go on to have you. And you are on the receiving end of all the trauma that your lineage has suffered. But many of us are not aware of that because we don't talk about it enough. Now, let's say the traumatic event, like we said, was slavery or genocide. So biologically, we understand how that affects us through epigenetics. Our DNA or our parents' DNA, grandfather, grandmother, great-grandmother DNA literally gets rearranged and it's passed down, passed down, passed down. That's how it affects us biologically. Then we get to the behaviors. So the behaviors that we adopt in our families to cope with the trauma that we went through in our lineage usually are those that are more on the negative side. So you might see substance abuse in your family. You might see irritability within yourself or within your family. You can also see attachment issues, right? I think many of us are aware of disorganized attachment, anxious attachment, avoidant attachment, and secure attachment. I would definitely recommend you take that quiz if you haven't. I think it will give you some real insight into how your attachment styles to your loved ones and your romantic partners affect you today. Now, if we look at these behaviors, we could think like, yeah, I do have a few uncles or aunts who are abusing alcohol, or I do have some uncles and aunts who have a really quick temper, or some attachment issues, some abandonment issues, some lack of accountability. And all of these things are usually effects of something. You don't come out the womb drinking, right? We don't learn that we need authority when we come out the womb. That's something that life teaches us by way of unfortunate events. And some of us have not gone through a super unfortunate event, but it turns into that because now this unfortunate event, like the actual trauma that changed the way our DNA expresses itself, not only does it do that, but it also affects our family personality. And we adopt those traits. So that's how we keep the trauma within our family. And then you ask, what does this cause? What are the effects of keeping this kind of trauma within our family, right? It's already rooted into us because of our actual DNA. And we also have it embedded throughout our personality, the way that we escape, the way that we cope within our families as well. So you ask yourself, what are the ramifications for me when things like this happen? Changes in our behavior and our biology, like we talked about earlier, is a perfect environment for mental health issues to manifest. So now you're talking about anxiety, depression, schizophrenia. It also makes it very easy for even physical ailments to exist, like stress, like phantom pains that you're not quite sure. You may have gone to the doctor, or a family member may have gone to the doctor. They're not quite sure what's actually causing the pain. And we're not realizing how deeply this really runs. We're not realizing that because our lineage has gone through so much and experienced so much trauma, and now not only has it affected us DNA wise, but we also practice it. Now we're experiencing a myriad of issues. And then guess what? Then here is you wondering what is wrong with you. Now, this is the most important part of the lesson. This is the most important part of your work. Because once we understand how we're actually made up biologically and behaviorally from our ancestors, and remember, we don't have to think so far down the line. It helps for the example purpose. But also think about your more immediate ancestors, right? Ancestors are just people who are older than us. They were born before us in our family line. So if you think about your uncle, your grandfather, your grandmother and her bitterness, or your grandfather and his coldness or his aloofness, his fear, his anxiety, those are the things that we want to start to really think about and how it has molded who we are today. Because so many of us, we want out of this trap because it feels like one. It feels like we try to make progress and it doesn't work. We try so many methods. So many of us are trying to become our highest and best self, and it just doesn't work for many of us, and we wonder why. And all this time, it could be that many of us are bearing burdens that just aren't ours. So you ask, what next steps can you take? How can you make sure that this is something that you can actually break out of? So you know there's a big popularized term now called generational curses. And I believe that ancestral trauma, when not treated properly, can indeed turn into a generational curse. Meaning it's a cycle that your family has a hard time freeing themselves of because we don't quite understand what we're really up against. Now that you know what you're up against, and I hope you've been taking notes because this is not a channel where we just watch and for entertainment purposes. No, no, no. We watch this channel only to make real changes. And you guys know that, so get those notes and let me know down below in the comments what you found most helpful about this video. Now, I kind of want to go into solutions in ways that we can really make sure that we're reprogramming our mind and our body literally, so that way we can break these generational curses and we're no longer subject to ancestral trauma. Now, we can go about this, I'd say about 3 ways. One is more comfortable than the other two, so I'll start with comfort. Mindfulness is key. By you simply watching this video and take notes, like the studious person that you are, like the person that wants to really help themselves that you are, that's the first start. That is the first step of you really breaking these curses. Just simply being mindful and knowing that it's there gives you a sense of relief. Not even having done any work yet, not having confronted family members, which you can do, that's what we'll talk about in a minute, but at least being mindful and bringing some sort of awareness to what has happened is the most important thing, because only when we're aware of it can we start to attack the problem. So you ask yourself, what ways can you be super mindful about it? Now, my other video on escapism could be an effect of also ancestral trauma, so check that out. But if you have watched it, shout out to you. And there are some things within that video that you can absolutely apply here, but I'll go over a quick recap. So for mindfulness, what I want you to do is track your triggers. What do I mean by track your triggers? When you think about that family member that just gets under your skin, or you think about that moment when you're by yourself and you're feeling frustrated, you're feeling guilt, you're feeling shame, or you're thinking about that last failure of yours, that thing that you said that you would go after and that you would do really well at and you haven't really excelled much, that is the thing that I want you to bring mindfulness to or awareness to, and ask yourself, what are these feelings and why do I have these feelings? Why am I so hard on myself? Who did I see do this? Where do I get this from? Now, this is not about blame game. All we're doing is simply calling our power back to ourselves so that we can actually do something. As much as it would be wonderful to blame others for our problems, only if they could fix them, that would be great, right? But the thing is, they can't. So that is a very futile thing to try and engage with. So I don't recommend that. I recommend you being responsible for every action and every emotion that you have. Yes, it's messed up. It was in your family tradition, or your family hasn't shown the best coping mechanism because of trauma, or you're also affected DNA wise. We get that. We're starting behind the 8 ball, but that's okay. Everybody is, right? Everybody is. But you're different. You're actually going to take your life by the reins and choose to think a different thing, to think a new thing. So I want you to have a ton of grace with yourself, but mindfulness will bring you straight to looking at your triggers and why they're there. Now, the next thing that we can focus on in terms of breaking this generational curse or allowing our ancestral trauma to kind of fall away and end is we can also consult a therapist. I have a really good video coming up on therapy, and you're not going to want to miss it, okay? I'm going to say this now. Don't get mad at me, but it's coming. And you'll see why. But anywho, therapist, right? This is somebody that you can talk out your issues with, talk out your anxieties, your fears, your frustrations, your family stuff with. I know that's uncomfortable, especially for many of us in the community, but it can be very helpful to talk to somebody who is trained to understand your psyche and to understand the complexities of the human experience. This would be a pretty good idea. Now, aside from therapy, and I think this one is probably the most difficult, because with a therapist, you're talking to a stranger, so you can tell this person whatever and go on about your day. I don't even care what they say to friends and all that other stuff, because I don't know you like that, right? But this one, I think, is the most difficult. This one. I don't want no smoke, right? So we can just confront our family. You could just ask your mother. You could just ask your father. Or if you have not been raised by your biological parents, you can ask your foster parents or your guardians a little bit more about your lineage, or you can search into it and wonder, damn, why aren't I that much like my foster parents, although I was raised with them since very young? The DNA aspect, right? So it could be fruitful for you to look into that. Now, when you confront family, this is a very sensitive topic, because I would assume that you want to confront them because there's some things or some fears or some concerns that you have about your own self, maybe the way that you express your pain or the way that you deal with your pain, right? Because we talked about behaviorally. So maybe you don't deal with it in the best way. Maybe you're a big procrastinator. Maybe you're a self-sabotager. Maybe you have imposter syndrome and you're wondering where all these things come from. But if you have somebody in your family that you can trust and somebody that is okay with a little bit of confrontation, I think that that would be a really good person to go to. It's likely the person that you first had in your mind when I spoke about it, the person who probably wouldn't react over the top. I know some of us can have some family members where this just won't even work, so I don't recommend unless you're very brave and you want all the smoke, right? So you could ask them questions like, hey, why did you never say that you love me? Or I didn't feel really protected during this time. What happened? Why do you drink so much? Why did you choose drugs? Why did you abandon us? These are very hard things to deal with and very hard issues to talk about. But it could be worth it because you may get deeper insight. After the anger and after the frustration with the family, you could get deeper insight into, wow, I can see how in my lineage this has affected us all. Because many times when you ask your parents this, they will mention, well, this is how I was raised. This is how your grandmother did it. This is how your grandfather did it. This is how their mother and father did it. This is all we know. You may hear phrases like that. And though, again, it could be frustrating, I think there's also freedom in that. Because what that does is allow you to say, wow, I'm just raised by a bunch of wounded people. We're all wounded people. And I choose to do a different thing. And even doing this is extremely brave. So I just want to shout out to you guys because this is a very important, I think this is a very pivotal point in someone's life when you get here, when you're trying to heal this deeply, this fully. Because I'd assume that you only care about healing this deeply and this fully because you've got some work to do. And you want to do that. You want to walk in your truth. You want to walk in your purpose. You want to walk in the purpose that you've been given, right? You're here for a very, very special reason. Like, you are here for a very special reason. And I think that the only reason why you're attracted to this video is because you're attempting to figure that out. But some of us, perhaps we could ignore the trauma and we have positive coping mechanisms, but some of us don't. Like we talked about the behaviors, substance abuse, and to even make a little lighter than that, constant scrolling on Instagram, escapism, ignoring pain, allowing things to fester is also a trauma response. We don't do that when we come out the womb. If you want to know if you're traumatized, ask yourself, would a 2-year-old do this? Would a 3-year-old do this? They're the most pure people in the world. And the people who have like no history as far as what they can remember, right? So you're not really born with trauma aside from childbirth being a very traumatic experience, but you guys know what I'm trying to say. Now, if you're able to do all these things, I just want to give you your flowers now and really shout you out because you are an awesome human being for even trying. Imagine from you doing all these things, imagine the things that the people who come after you don't have to go through. I saw a quote one time and it said, it ran into my family, or it ran in my family until it ran into me. How powerful that we are attempting to make sure that those after us live a life of better coping mechanisms, a life of more ease and resilience and a stronger mind, body, and spirit because of what you chose to do today. That is why it would be remiss of us to take this message lightly. Now, if you got anything of value, please comment, please share and subscribe. This channel is going up. I have some really, really special things planned for the channel, so stay tuned and I will see you guys in the next video.